Welcome to the Off the Page podcast from Franciscan Media, a podcast that will feature in-depth conversations with Franciscan authors and artists. My name is Stephen Copeland, and I'm the book editor here at Franciscan Media, and today I'll be interviewing Dr. and Reverend Bruce Epperly, whose new book, Head, Heart, and Hands, An Introduction to Saint Bonaventure, will be the focus of our conversation. Bruce is widely published within Franciscan Media. You may recognize his name from Pause and Pray, our daily prayers that get emailed to your inbox every morning, and he is also the author of Walking with Francis of Assisi and Simplicity, Spirituality, and Service. All these books can be purchased in our store at shop.franciscanmedia.org. A little more about Bruce. He has served as a congregational pastor, university chaplain, professor, and seminary administrator for over 40 years. And he is the author of more than 70 books on practical theology, ministry, and spirituality, healing and wholeness, and process theology. As you'll hear in our conversation, his own theological diversity, I think, really it allows him to make some fascinating connections as he weaves together varying theological voices and traditions. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation, so without further ado, here is Bruce Epperly. I thought we'd start out. I thought your introduction to Head, Heart, and Hands, your new book coming out on May 7th, Introductory to Bonaventure, I thought it was a really wonderful introduction and a great on-ramp to the importance of theology. And I think it's a really necessary introduction to someone like Bonaventure, who's extremely complex, at least to our modern ears. So I figured we'd start off. What is theology and why is it important? That's the title of your introduction. And let's launch off there.
Well, theology initially for me is just simply loving God with your mind. That's the, in some sense, the head. And it really can't be disconnected from the heart and the hands, of course. Many people who've are part of faith traditions, they don't think of themselves as theologians, but the minute they start thinking about suffering or war or violence, they become theologians. And the job of a theologian is to help people to try to put their lives in a framework that's going to be healthy for them and the world. The problem of evil is obviously one of them that is key, and people try to figure, well, where's God in all of this? And of course, the public language is that somehow or other God caused this, or that you're being punished for your sins, or if you want to move to the new spiritual movements, you're being punished for your negative thinking. It's always a danger for a minister or priest to be at a wedding reception. We, like everyone else, like to have a drink and an hors d'oeuvre. And more often than I can imagine, somebody's come up to me at a wedding reception and begun a discourse about some event that's happened in their lives. Now, I'm just wanting to have a gin and tonic myself. But when you're a theologian, you're on duty 24 hours a day. And when you're the person who just performed the wedding, you're on duty till you go home. And countless times somebody said, now I've had this issue and I'm struggling with a belief in God. And usually they find out that their issue is one that I agree with, that God didn't cause the miscarriage, that God wasn't trying to teach them a lesson. And the theologian tries to join head and heart in a way that helps us to move on with our lives creatively. The head isn't everything, and that's one of the keys to Bonaventure's and Francis and Clare's thinking. These people, Francis, Bonaventure, and Clare, are extremely erudite people with different kinds of gifts. Bonaventure obviously was the intellectual in the group. That was how he went with things. Francis was much more ambient. He was a poet. He was a troubadour, God's fool. Clare was very incisive. She had a certain sensate sense of, let's gaze at the cross. Let's gaze at the cross. And when you gaze at the cross is an icon of God's love for you. I think the theologian has to include all of those. And of course, theology, as Alfred North Whitehead says, and that all great religions begin with some sort of mystical experience. Whether it be Francis in the chapel, hearing a voice that says, "Repair my church," or at Alverna, experiencing the suffering of God, or himself, Bonaventure, going to Alverna and not experiencing the stigmata, but feeling such an affinity with Francis that he seems to be welcomed into Francis' experience. It's a truly mystical experience for Bonaventure, and Bonaventure can be read as very dry, but at the same context, when you read his soul's journey to God, or his stories about how to approach the life of Jesus, I mean, he's kin to Ignatius of Loyola. They both, in terms of the life of Jesus, they both want you to be there, right, watching the scene. They want you to be with the woman who's being accused of adultery. They want you to be among the women at the cross, or if we might say Mary of Magdala in the garden, because they saw that theology is not just a heady experience, but the imaginative experience that you can experience what you're talking about. I have this little trinity of thinking that I've used in some of my other work, and it's implicit in the Bonaventure book. I'm trying to remember if I stated explicitly that good theology involves a vision, a promise, and a practice. The vision is, how do we look at the world? What kind of world do you live in? Is it, as Howard Thurman says, is it a world ideally of friendly people in a friendly universe? That's the prelude to the beloved community, by the way. Is it a world in which we're going to, step on a crack, break your mother's back? There's no grace whatsoever. Is a world of an authoritarian God that influences authoritarian politics and binary politics? Is a God of love that encourages us to be relational in our behaviors? Then I think good theology is, and it's what at least I believe, and I've been fortunate enough to be like Bonaventure, an academic who also went to the hospital to visit dying people, who comforted grieving families. I mean, one of the Bonaventure is not a heady theologian. He was at the graveside too. He was in the academic room and in a study, but he also had to manage an organization and do it ethically. And he also comforted the sick. And the promise is that you can experience the faith you affirm. And then the practice is how you can help yourself and others experience it. And interesting enough, the soul's journey to God has all of those. He talks about how you mount from the visible world to the experience of the divine and then go back down. I mean, it's really an exegesis or an interpretation. I don't want to use too many fancy words. It's an interpretation of Jacob's dream of the ladder of angels, which is often misunderstood by preachers. The angels start on earth. That's something that's not seen by a lot of readers, and it's the same for Bonaventure. You begin with the senses. You begin with the meal you just shared. And God's in the senses, God's in the meal. God's right here with us. And then you have a wider and wider vision. He talks about it in terms of an ascent, but the ascent never forgets where you come from. And the ascent, the angels go up into heaven, and then they come back down to earth. And so Bonaventure ascends unto heaven, and then he tries to keep the order together between the traveling monks and the ones that are like himself, scholastics teaching in congregations. So that's maybe a long answer to a short question, but I think everyone's an implicit theologian. And we need to reflect on what our theology means and what kind of God. I think it's Terry Fretheim, the biblical scholar, that says it's more important to ask the question, what kind of God do you believe in than do you believe in God? Because we see the visions of God being worked out in our attitudes toward immigration or politics or the Middle East. Who's in and who's out? Who deserves our ethical consideration? Who doesn't? It matters.
Yeah. No, there's a lot there. And you mentioned a couple aspects of Bonaventure. I think this goes to the title of your book, head, heart, and hands. Bonaventure, as you said, was a scholastic. He was of the institution. And yet he's inviting us in many passages to experience the divine through our senses, through the heart, through our
Yes.
hands. So, can you talk a little bit about your title and why that is such an appropriate title for a theologian like Bonaventure?
Well, and I think in part it goes back to his attempt to live out as a theologian the spirit of Francis. For Bonaventure, Francis is the perfect Christian, not necessarily to be repeated at home, as they used to say about on those infomercials, because Bonaventure didn't repeat it.
Hmm.
But in Francis, he saw a person whose faith and experience of God drove him out into the world. I don't want to localize mysticism in any particular part of a person's life because I think the religious sense is everywhere. There's no religious organ in our bodies. It's the organ of the whole being. I think that and although Francis didn't ever claim to be a theologian, he was well studied. He knew what he was talking about. I think you can be somebody who, let's put it in the 21st century. You can be a Christian, a follower of Jesus, and I'm not excluding Buddhists and Hindus and Jews and Muslims and pagans from this, who is as smart as anyone in the room. Too often, people of faith have been, and some of it's our own fault, have been the people who are most frightened by new knowledge and new awareness. Bonaventure, even though he lived 1,000 years ago, his theology is a dynamic theology which would have welcomed new insights. I'm not as well versed with Anselm as I am with Bonaventure, but I think if Bonaventure had become the theologian of the Western Church, we would be in a very different place. Bonaventure is in his own way, and I am a person that identified with process theology, so I don't want to read into him what isn't there. But in his own way, his theology is very dynamic. You can't have a fountain flowing that isn't flowing, and it goes back to old Heraclitus of some 2,500 years ago. Everything flows. If it's flowing, then it's dynamic, and it's changing and it's growing. I think that probably Teilhard de Chardin, who's another influence on my life, would have felt quite comfortable with Bonaventure. I don't, and he would have felt comfortable with Teilhard. Theory of evolution, even though he lived long before Darwin, and held some traditional doctrines as he should have done in the 11th century, theology grows. To come at theology with the head means you come out growing. The heart, though, I mean, you look at Francis, and again, in many ways, Bonaventure knows he's not Francis, and he doesn't want to be Francis. He knows his gifts are different. But when he looks at what the person he'd aspire to be in his relationships, he says, look at Francis. He didn't write there's obviously critical comments about his biography of Francis, but I find it a darned darned fair biography. Of course, every biographer has a perspective, and he was an institutionalist, so you can't avoid that. But his Francis is the one who goes out and embraces the persons with leprosy. His Francis is the person who scolds the birds for talking during his sermon, but also preaches a sermon to the sparrows. His Francis has the heart, a little evangelism here of going over and crossing boundaries to visit the Sultan. Both of them want to convince each other about the rightness of their perspective, I mean, but Francis keeps in dialogue, and the Sultan, for his, we have to give the Sultan credit too, welcomes Francis. The heart. And then, of course, you can't talk about Franciscan theology without talking about the hands. After all, even though he may have over-literalized it, Francis decided he wasn't going to rebuild the chapel at San Damiano and a couple others. And before he discovered that the chapel he needed to rebuild was the church of his time, and I believe in the spirit of Pope Francis, it's no longer repair your church, it's the church of the world we need to repair. Repair the world. That goes, and it's hard not to connect Francis with the notion of tikkun, and Bonaventure as well, that our task is to repair or heal the earth. And so I think these fit together. They're holistically. I mean, we all have our own personalities and things that are our gifts, but the holistic or individuated, to quote Jung, the whole person theology that has the 3 food groups or 4 food groups, I grew up in it with, has to have the wisdom to not turn your back on the world. I see Bonaventure recognize the ambiguity of science, but he wouldn't be protesting against vaccines. He might have a word or two to say to Tony Fauci. I live in an NIH neighborhood here in Potomac, and Tony is a saint in our neighborhood. He is a saint to me. He's somebody who's the product of the best kind of religious education, raised in a Roman Catholic Church, and everything he's doing is grounded in his education. That's a person for others. I think the heart is that we feel the pain of the world, that we don't turn our back on the pain of children in Gaza or children in Israel or children in Iran, frankly. And of course, Bonaventure has the hand of an administrator in trying to resolve differences in the Franciscan order so that it would be around 1,000 years later. So there'd be a Franciscan Media. He had no idea that there'd be Franciscan studies in the University of San Diego. He had no idea of these things they'd be publishing books about him. But he knew that Francis had to be communicated, and he needed an institution that was holistic to do so. He didn't use this language, but when you get the 2 different groups, the mendicant priests and the homeward priests, the homebound priests, together or try to unite the Western and Eastern Church, which of course that's still a long way to go. And of course I'm speaking as a Protestant here. There's more Protestants denomination and sects than you can shake a stick at. And one decides that April 23rd we better get to work is going to be the next end of the world after Jesus didn't come on April the 8th, the day of the eclipse. Then there's another 15 days later, Jesus is going to come again. And of course, Bonaventure would say, hey, use your minds, people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I really do think it's a perfect title for him, Head, Heart, and Hands, because he is uniquely integrating all of those and trying to invite readers and people who were he was talking to at that time and sharing theology with into the dynamic aspects of all three of those aspects of the human person, and what it means to be fully alive in Christ.
Yes,
And
yes,
you mentioned a lot there, but there's one thing I wanted you to go deeper into for the listener. We talked about Bonaventure being a theologian for our time,
yeah,
and process theology in particular. You brought that up, and Bonaventure's metaphor of fountain fullness.
yes,
I'd love for you to go deeper into that because, for me at least, reading him, I mean, that is one of the most dynamic metaphors for God I've ever heard.
yes.
And I think I agree with you. I think it does align very much with, even though he wouldn't have said this, I think it does very much align with process theology and modern discoveries in science.
Yes. And even cross-denominational or interreligious, I mean, uh, in some ways, the fountain is the Tao with an intention.
Mm, hmm,
You know, the ever-flowing stream of life that has an intention to it. Or you can see the same, and again, I'll point your readers to somebody I just mentioned, to the movements of evolution toward the what people like Teilhard and Iliadelio would call the Christ Omega. But the fountain is an interesting image because the fountain is ever flowing. It doesn't stop. There's no zero sum in the fountain.
hmm,
That Bonaventure, there's no God, and then all of a sudden God comes to the end of God's work in the universe. The fountain is not that nobody's going to plug it up, and certainly God isn't going to plug the fountain. And that's an interesting thing to ponder because many
hmm,
people have the notion that God has done all God's going to do, or that God uh, is locked in some primordial vision of how things will be ever and anon, and God can't change the course of it. This fountain is a very intentional fountain, and its aim is to create the universe out of love. You know, we might. I haven't done the science here, so we might ponder the fountain flowing into this particular universe uh, and bringing forth what we call the Big Bang, a little trickle. You know, the Big Bang is about the size of your fingernail or smaller, that a little trickle of it comes there. Even though he was certainly caught in the worldview of his time, he might ponder that God has never not been a fountain. And
hmm,
initially, the fountain, in terms of the way he talked, was a fountain that was flowing between the persons of the Trinity. Uh, that you know, that you can't separate a drop from the ocean or a drop from the fountain. So you know, but each drop is uniquely itself. Uh, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, or as we say more in my denomination, Creator, Christ, and Inspirer, or something like
hmm.
that.
I love that. Yeah.
And you know, and yet the fountain flows into the world, so it's flowing right through our podcast right now, because if it quit flowing, we'd cease to exist. And yet at the same time, the fountain is allowing each one of the drops to be a drop of the fountain. I don't see any predestination in Bonaventure. I don't see any coercion in terms of this is determined by God. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I think that uh, he believed in the creativity of the word, whether it was the word on the page or the word made flesh. And then, of course, the fountain flows through everyone else. Uh, you know, this is a fountain that flows everywhere. It is not just it's not a canal. It doesn't have a boundary to it. So that fountain is flowing through Gaza, it's flowing through Jerusalem, it's flowing through Potomac, Maryland, it's flowing through the inner city, it's flowing through Appalachia, it's flowing through people we love and people we don't love.
Hmm,
And inviting us maybe to realize that the person we don't love is also part of the fountain as well, and that we're connected even if we don't think so. And it's dynamic, it's forward moving. Again, Bonaventure can't be judged positively or negatively. He's a person of his time in terms of his cosmology or way of looking at the world. but I do believe that he would feel comfortable with an evolutionary vision and an evolutionary institution and an evolutionary religion that isn't locked into the past. A fountain can't be locked in the past because it's flowing. I mean, the only fountain that's locked in the past is a fountain that's plugged.
Mm.
And that doesn't mean, but all the waters that have flowed through it, which includes the saints of the church and the good ancestors and the creeds of the past, are part of that flow too. You know, that they are not disparaged, nor do there's an influence cease, but they are also part of a larger flow.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, when we choose to partner with the flow of the fountain, where would Bonaventure say, in your words, that it's taking us?
Well, that's a good, what I was thinking, and again, I grew up in the West Coast, in Santa Cruz area of San Jose, Santa Cruz, California, and of course, I couldn't help but think of people surfing. But
Hmm.
to be honest, the surf's up, so to speak. But I think the flow is to become as large a spirited person as you can be,
Hmm.
and the flow to believe that you are connected. Bill McKibben, the environmentalist, makes I think, a very sweet and pithy saying: the best thing an individual can do to respond to the global climate change and environmental crisis is quit being an individual.
Hmm.
You cannot be a drop of water by yourself. You're connected to every other one. And I think that the philosopher Whitehead made the comment that the religion, or the true peace and the true religious sense, is to go from self-interest to world loyalty.
Hmm.
There's something bigger than us, and we're part of it. And we're important. I mean, there's nothing in Bonaventure that would deny the value of the person sitting in the room and their own uniqueness, but their own uniqueness is connected with every other. And in a way, he's thinking again of Francis, who struggled obviously with his limitations. The greatest example was the encounter with the persons with leprosy. That he, like many of us, doesn't mind giving them an alms from a distance. Yeah, and he was a very generous person all his life, even before his revelation and various revelatory experiences. He was a very generous person. He'd give you that bottle of wine if he had it.
Hmm.
He'd invite you over to the house. He'd give you the tunic off his bath. But all of a sudden he realized at the same time he felt a total alienation from persons with leprosy. He was he's a little bit like during the height of COVID, when people were afraid to be walking outside, and if your neighbor came out their front stoop, you'd go back in.
Yeah. Yep.
I remember, as just a bit of a side, at the time of COVID at its height, I was living on Cape Cod, and I'd made that my practice of walking on the beach almost every morning, when rain, shine, or snow or ice. And then we were so frightened at first, if I'd see another walker in the distance, I'd kind of go over to the other side of the road. I mean, no, breath can kill. Breath can kill.
Yeah.
I mean, how much we've learned. But God reveals to Francis, that's my child there. And Francis not only gives him a coin and becomes the saint of persons with leprosy, he gives the man a hug and a kiss.
Hmm.
The empathy, we are not, Ubuntu would be a wonderful word here. We are here because of one another.
Hmm.
And the sort of sense that it really does matter to me what happens somewhere else. The fountain is not zero sum, that the more I go with the flow of God's grace, the more grace there is for others. And even though Bonaventure wouldn't explicitly say this, someone like Francis and us adds to the value of life and what God can do in the world by our own alignment with God's vision.
Yeah, I think it's such a profound quote. The fountain is not zero sum. And I think it's important to consider that today, because so much of the world's games, especially, moving into an election year,
Yeah,
and so much is zero sum, and it's either
yeah,
or, and it's it's like we are blind in many ways to the fountain that's flowing in our midst
yes, yes.
when we slip into those kinds of games. Would you
Well,
agree?
we yeah,
Yeah.
we want to have the extra gulp for ourselves when we don't need to worry about it going dry. There's
Yeah.
no drought of God's love. There's no drought of God's love, which very well then reminds us that that we don't have to be self-interested in a small sense, but we can be self-interested in the sense that our self-interest expands to include others. It really does matter whether a child coming up from Central America, it really does matter to us. Jesus, Maria, and Jose are always coming up from the border. The Holy Family is coming up daily. It does matter whether they are treated as human beings, apart from immigration policy. Apart from that, it matters that they should treat them as human beings. It does matter to our own souls that we not get caught up in hatred of those policies of the persons who have the policies that we disagree with. It really does matter to the quality of the whole nation and the whole planet.
Yeah, well, that's a real challenging and
Oh, tell me
integrative
about it.
move in partnering with the fountain, I think, I'm curious if you agree, but to awaken to the reality that that fountain's flowing in places that I don't expect, in places that I've already made judgments about.
Well, yes.
Is the fountain still flowing there? And I can still experience God's grace and beauty and depth, um, through the places and the people that I've already written off.
Well, yes, and that's one of the hardest things, but probably one of the necessary things that we. It's in another text I wrote a while ago on Howard Thurman. I entitled the text "Prophetic Healing." That the prophet, and Lord knows they're pretty scathing. Prophets are pretty scathing in their critique of the institutions we're part of, but they do it as members of the community. Amos or Hosea or Micah or Isaiah or Jeremiah don't act as if they're above it all. They assume they look in the mirror too and see something of themselves in what they criticize. And their criticism of and it's pretty harsh sometimes, of the order in which they live is motivated by healing and not hate. It's motivated by the hope that the persons that we most disparage find wholeness in the way that God intends for them, and a letting go of what that should be. A letting, just as at some level I can't control my own process of wholeness, I have to render to a deeper and greater power and wisdom in my life and of course that power and wisdom is delighted when I take some agency in the process. I don't think Francis was a very agential person. Francis took a lot of initiative. He wasn't waiting for God to do what he could do himself. I mean, everything's the grace of God, but you think of Teresa of Avila, that wonderful saying that God has no hands but ours, and we are the eyes through which God sees the world. On the one hand, it says that God experiences the world of pain that we do, and that God is the one who invites us to make a difference. There's nothing in the Gospels, and I'm a regular every week Bible study teacher. I've been doing it for ages. Nothing in the Gospels say wait for God to do it. Nothing in the prophets says wait for God to do it. It's about how we reach out to another in a way that preserves their wholeness and humanity and the non-human world as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think listeners tuning into this can see and hear what we at Franciscan Media feel about you is that you are so good, Bruce, at weaving in your own personal stories and your own personal experiences with, in this case, Bonaventure's theology. And I think listeners can tell right now that, this is incarnational, the Richard Rohr
Well,
work,
yes.
as it
Yeah.
should be, as you outlined at the beginning, is why theology is important. But I'm curious, in that same vein, what kind of impact has Bonaventure had on your own life as a theologian?
Well, and this is an interesting thing, and I often at times apologize in advance when I'm working on a project, and it's not really the apology of I've done something wrong here, but an apology in the Platonic sense of a word from. This is what when I'm working on something, I usually don't work at it at arm's length. Uh, when I set out on this book, and I probably was in some sense when the Franciscan Media, when Kelly McCracken asked me to write this, I really was not prepared to do so. I'm not initially wasn't a Bonaventure scholar. And
Hmm.
maybe that made me the perfect person to write an introduction because I was introducing myself in the process. And I did what I did with all three of the Franciscan books. It's interesting. You may not know this. I never submitted a request to write any of those books.
Hmm.
You may know because I may have mentioned it in the first book, Walking with Francis of Assisi. Kelly McCracken had seen a little religion page, 800-word document I wrote for the Cape Cod Times.
Hmm.
And she saw it and wrote me a note and said, would you think of doing something longer? And I had other things I was doing. I was pastor of a church up there and busy about that, was still teaching at Wesley Theological in Washington, D.C. part-time. And I did what I always do, and I did from this book. I prayed about it, and I assume that prayer doesn't force the hand of God in any way, but I listened for what response I would get. And in terms of the first book, I was walking on the beach in Cape Cod, and I heard the voice that said, and I'm not here talking about the heavens didn't open up, but an inclination, you might say. My heart was strangely warmed. I said, you can write this book. I wasn't a Franciscan scholar. I loved Francis, but that wasn't the reason Kelly asked me to write the book. She thought I could say something new. And I got the wisdom to write the book. By the time I walked back to the home, I'd had in my mind all the chapters. The
Hmm.
same thing, interesting thing enough, happened with the Bonaventure book. I couldn't claim to be an Ilia Delio in that area, and I think she's just the best thing since sliced bread. And that's a 1950s saying, Wonder Bread, sliced bread, because she's written really a tremendous book, simply Bonaventure. I was praying about it and reading her book. I said, could I say something that Ilia didn't say it, or say it in my own way? And I was again walking along in this case, in my Potomac, Maryland, a little suburb outside Washington, D.C. neighborhood. And I heard the birds singing. And I don't know if the birds intended to tell me what they did, but a word kind of occurred. You should do this. You should do this. It was a little bit like St. Augustine, saying, take this book, It's, I haven't put it in my confessions yet, but but there was a sense you should do this. and I assumed it was coming out of the depths of my psyche to do this, or spirit. I don't claim that when I have an idea, it comes from God. It comes through me, so it has my own stamp on it. But so the book became very personal, and as you know, as an editor, and you reminded me about this a few times. There was sometimes very little light between me and Bonaventure in the book, and it was hard to figure out which one was which. And that's the way I work at these things, you know. If it's worth studying, it's worth becoming a partner with this person.
Hmm.
For him, I think the key notion was really the fountain. The fountain that, you know, I have to keep reminding myself that I'm connected. And I think the notion of spiritual growth is something we have to do every moment of the day. The notion, the fountain, occurred to me a couple weeks ago in a sort of an annoying situation. And it's just, you know, we had come back from holiday and we had left our golden doodle. He's a 85. He was 95-pound dog at the time. He lost 10 pounds at a kennel, and it's a pretty good kennel. I won't fault them, but apparently he had an infection, and the day we came home, he just quit moving. So it was Saturday night, of course, so we took him to the dog emergency hospital. And, you know, after waiting 4 hours and nothing happening, it's like going to the emergency room at the hospital. You know, I was starting to feel a little perturbed. And then I remembered, I'm connected with all these people here today. I'm connected with the overly busy tech and the veterinarian on duty and the people who've brought their companion animals with them. And my way of looking at the whole situation immediately changed. This was all my internal dialogue. Externally, I was, you know, a civil person. You know, we all know how to have a public face that's different than how we feel. But when I began to invoke that sort of notion of the fountain flowing through all of us, that we're connected here, there's no other. And when I use the term "there's no other," I'm not talking about pantheism. I'm just saying there's no wall between me and the person who's brought their dog in, who's stepped on some barbed wire and may have to lose a leg or something. There's no difference between me and the harried person who's 7 people have just asked, when are you going to treat my dog or cat? And my spiritual state immediately changed. And so for me, this is very real. And sometimes it inspires me, and sometimes it at the same time serves as a way of saying, hey, go back to where you should be. Go back to the person you believe you are or want to be, and not somebody who's kvetching about this one thing or another. Remind yourself of the flow. Remind yourself of the bigger picture. Remind yourself, and again, each one of us is a quote that Bonaventure has, and nobody knows the first person who said this. God is a circle, or infinite sphere. Bonaventure adds the infinite sphere to it. That's sort of his twist. Whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. Nobody exactly knows. It's probably property of the human race. Property of some mystic on a hill. I've even been looking for it. Somebody one place said it was from Empedocles, a pre-Socratic philosopher. I've been looking for at all the fragments to figure out whether it's there or not. I haven't found it yet. But I am connected with every other center. The center of the universe is right where we're sitting. This is the ladder of the angels. This is the God is in this place and I did not know it. God is in this place and now I do. But everyone else is at the center. So the center is also in a courtroom in New York City. The center is also with the fellows working on our home, and the center is also with me trying to figure out, well, how am I going to pay for another 5,000 on this? And of course, I'm a privileged person who can do that. But the center is me fretting about those things. the circumference is nowhere, which means there's no place outside of God's care.
Hmm.
I mean, and I actually think if we were to add to Bonaventure and Nicholas of Cusa and others who've invoked this, that we'd call it a spiral at the end of the day,
Yeah.
because there is no the circumference is really a flexible circumference. It's got holes in it. It's like a net in the sense that it's not going to stop flowing. It keeps getting larger all the time.
Hmm.
And no one's outside of it, nor is any moment outside of it. And keep reminding myself of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that quote you're referring to from Bonaventure is, I've got it written down right here. God is an intelligible sphere
Yep.
whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. So I think to some, that's terrifying.
Well, it
You know,
surely
we,
is.
we, we like our control. We like to go through
Yeah.
our to-do list. We like to make our life and our world and our reality about us,
Yeah.
revolving around us. Talk a little bit about why that's actually a liberating notion that Bonaventure is inviting us into.
Well, I think the first and most liberating part of it for me is that I am at the center of God's care, and so is everyone else.
Hmm.
As a pastor, as well as theologian, I oftentimes in our congregation I last pastored on Cape Cod would tell the children, so I give them a little motto, that if they got this, I thought that they would be in great shape the rest of their lives. God loves you. We love you. You matter, and you can do something great with your life. The center always matters, and so does everyone else.
Hmm.
You can advocate for yourself, and you should. As Rabbi Hillel says, if I'm not for myself, who will be? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? So those other centers matter. So it even when I'm provoked by those other centers, and I have to remind myself on a daily basis when I take my dose of the news, try to take it in a homeopathic way, not too much, but that those people who show up on my news feed, or on when I'm looking at Facebook or something, and all these things come up, that are intended to hook me in. They're not intended to be neutral. They have a purpose. They have a purpose of getting me sucked into something so I'll be really motivated not to like something.
Hmm.
Now, you cannot like something and still love.
Hmm.
And you can expand your circle of love. And this is where the question of polarization, which is the hardest thing these days, because we begin to emulate those we accuse of misbehavior.
Hmm.
I mean, I do believe that there's a certain type of authoritarian Christianity that revels in the binary,
Hmm.
that revels in as David Fitch says, the church of us versus them, that revels in it. They have to have an enemy. They have to have an enemy. But it's just as easy when I turn on Democracy Now, Amy Goodman, or MSNBC, to discover that they want an enemy too.
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
somebody's out to get you. Well, they may be out to get you, but you don't have to play their game.
Yeah. And I think that's another reason, Bruce, and you mentioned it a little bit earlier, why Bonaventure truly is a theologian for our time, is that he was a peacemaker,
Yes.
just like Francis, and yet he was called to really, he had, I'd love for you to go deeper into the tasks he had before him in his peacekeeping missions, because he had his hands full, did he not?
Yes. And I think again, he walked a thin line. He was the student of a prophet. I mean, you can call Francis a mystic, but he was also a prophet. He was a a very well-behaved prophet in many ways, but he was a thorn in the flesh of the church because he was so different, and yet he was one of the most respectful children of the church. He never criticized the church, but his very being was critical of the church. You can't throw away all your riches, and the Pope in silk doesn't notice it, or the bishop in silk. And that's no critique of the popes or the bishops, but there was a difference. And Francis lived out of doors, trusting only God and the alms of others. And a couple, generations later, here we have Bonaventure having to make sure the lights are on, so to speak, having to make sure that the university stays in business, being the parent of the organization, the great father of the organization, which was a diverse organization. Again, one of his mediating tasks was to affirm both the traveling monks who had nothing and the ones who lived monastic lives but had something.
Yeah.
And the ones that lived monastic lives and had something, didn't probably all live with the simplicity of Francis. I mean, I have been in Franciscan orders and monasteries, and I've always been fed well there. I worked at Georgetown, and I knew if I wanted a better bottle of scotch than what I got at home, I'd go into the Jesuit community. They didn't own anything, but they were fed well. And how the sense of remembering that we have different callings. And certainly he dies while he's trying to negotiate a certain type of peace between the Eastern and Western Church that almost was to say that the diversity didn't need to be divisive. And again, you have from both Thomas of Solano and Bonaventure, say that Francis begins his sermon with "Peace be with you," and that was kind of the code word of the Franciscans as they were walking down the road. I mean, even though it's probably clear that Francis did not write the prayer of Saint Francis, and I felt bad in disabusing somewhat of that notion accidentally in a study group I was leading, but I quickly recovered because I'm a pastor as well as an academic, that this is the spirit of Francis. Lord, make me an instrument of peace. I invoke that every morning in my morning prayer, and pray that my grandchildren, and growing up in an anxious time, experience peace. That they experience peace, and I think it's A.J. Muste who says there's no way to peace, but that peace is the way, and we have to garner this peace as the Jewish mystics would say, one person, and I think they're too generous, one moment at a time. Bring peace to this moment. Let go for a moment of how you think things should be. As an administrator, and again, actually, from Bonaventure wrote one of the first books of management. I'm not an expert at that book, by the way, but he wanted to, maybe it was his version of the rule of Saint Benedict or something, but he wanted to use the Franciscan vision to also be a management style. Maybe he was an inspiration indirectly to one of my mottos as an administrator of organizations was, and as a pastor of churches where you are dealing with diverse groups. I have a vision, but not an agenda. The vision is, this is where we need to go. It's the beloved community. Wherever we show up, it's life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for everyone around the globe, not just Americans and not just American-born people and not just white Americans. That's my vision. How I get there in that apparently very left-wing vision, although it in fact is the gospel, may involve me sitting down, if I were a person of power, with Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, whose views are entirely different than my own, and saying, well, how do we make sure that people are not going hungry in the United States? And there's some examples of this. There are some very enlightened people who are more pro-choice, and people who are more pro-life in the slogans we use. Neither one is quite accurate, but in the slogans we use, who actually meet together. How do we have a country where there is both the rights that women should and ought to have of self-determination? There is also the male responsibility when any woman becomes pregnant, and also the sense that the fetus is part of this story too. I mean, sadly, something that is very good, women need to have equality. It's absolutely a need to have reproductive freedom. And fetuses need the ability to grow forth in this context without making it a political slogan. And it really requires, meeting with the Sultan. It really requires hugging the person with leprosy. It really requires sitting down and saying that, back to the fountain again, the fountain is flowing and it's bigger than us.
Yeah. And the fountain really does invite us to be curious.
Yes.
And to be empathetic toward the person who's perhaps most different than us.
Yes. The great American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr has this wonderful comment, and it's my translation of his English into my English. In his own work, it's not quite exactly what I'm saying, but I have to be aware of my own limitations, even as I see the truth in the limitations of others.
Mm.
A lot of the people we oppose deep down are, if we get cut beyond all the layers, they are motivated by what they believe is a good thing. And we have to figure out what that good thing is. Mothers need good diets. Babies need to be fed. There needs to be health care for every child born in this country. And at the same time, fetuses need to be respected in their lives. And all these need to be in a stew. And what is it we're trying to accomplish here? What's the vision? And the agenda, when I say I don't have an agenda, it simply means that, and I think this is probably what Bonaventure discovered as an administrator. Once you're working with people, it doesn't always work the way you thought it would be. But you still, as the Apostle Paul says, and as Martin Luther King says, you keep your eyes on the prize. The Bonaventure Franciscan worldview, when it's put into practice, is never going to be perfect. And sometimes you have to have penultimate achievements and celebrate them, but you don't forget the horizon. The horizon is the praised be you, praised be God by all God's creatures, is the horizon, the world of praise.
Yeah, it's beautiful, Bruce. And I think it's a great place for us to conclude. I think listeners can tell just how truly personal and applicable Bonaventure's theology is to our lived experience right now, and why you are really such a great voice as a vernacular theologian to bridge Bonaventure to an everyday audience. So, yeah, I really enjoyed this talk. Do you have anything else?
I think that that's enough for me. I'll take a vow of silence at this point and eat lunch, maybe.
Sounds great. Get that gin and tonic you mentioned.
Yeah, that'll come later.
Again, that was Dr. and Reverend Bruce Epperly. His new book, Head, Heart, and Hands, An Introduction to Saint Bonaventure, is available in the Franciscan Media store at shop.franciscanmedia.org. If you enjoyed this conversation, I think you're really going to enjoy his book. As you can tell, Bruce has the unique ability to bridge a medieval theologian like Bonaventure to our everyday lived experience. It's a wonderful introduction to Bonaventure's work, and I don't think there's another book like it in the market today. So, huge thanks to Bruce for being on the first episode of the Off the Page podcast from Franciscan Media, and thanks as well to Father Cyprian Concilio for providing the music for today's episode. I encourage you to check his music out on Spotify or wherever you listen to your music. This is Stephen Copeland signing off. Peace and all good.
I will lead you into the desert with me and tenderly speak to your